Greetings. I'm Professor Jagdish Sheth at Emory University. This presentation is about new frontiers of research in marketing, especially in marketing strategy, consumer behavior, and marketing analytics. Marketing as a discipline we know is only about 100 years old. I will try to give the historical perspective about the emergence of marketing as a discipline and as a practice. Think about marketing being separated from trading, for example, and then go in depth about the evolution of each one of the three subdisciplines of marketing, and then suggest new research opportunities for the next 20, 30, 40 years essentially. And I will conclude if the marketing will get reunited back again into one holistic discipline, or will it remain divided into these three subdisciplines. So let's start the journey. The title of the presentation is New Frontiers of Research in Marketing Strategy, Consumer Behavior, and Marketing Analytics. Marketing as a discipline we know today is only about 100 years old. It began in early 20th century, 1904, 1908, around that time. Several people began to articulate marketing as a discipline, and I'll come to that in more detail later on. Marketing practice, as we know, the professional practice is about 200 years old, began with one person in England, Thomas Barrett, and his company, where he was the marketing officer, no title at that time, but Pierce soap, which is still today alive and sold. It was a soap that was made from glycerin, translucent, very different, and he leveraged the differentiation advantage of the soap compared to other soap companies, knew how to do promotion, invite crowds to come, for example, do things that we know today, customer acquisition, customer loyalty, everything he did at that time. And that became the foundation because he was immediately copied by Unilever, especially for the Lux brand, which went global first, not in England. And then, of course, in America, it was imitated or copied by Procter & Gamble in the soap business. So marketing practice in many ways is anchored to what we call CPG, consumer packaged goods industry, especially soaps and detergents. Even today, you can see the brand management concepts, etc., anchored to that part of the marketing practice. Marketing practice began to change from the trading. Trading is about 2,500 years old. One can go back to the Silk Route, where Chinese products were sold in the European markets, ultimate destination, and European products were sold to China through many trading posts over time, where the clan leaders or the kings of those areas actually controlled the territory, but nurtured commerce, and it basically flourished very, very well. So the trading really, as we know today, I'm sure there was trading before, but trading is older, much older than marketing. Selling is as old as the civilization. I think we can go back to the Adam and Eve story or anything, and we can easily talk about selling was inherent in the human nature, whether it's a selling for products or selling for personal relationships or selling for anything. So I date selling as old as civilization, trading about 2,500 years old, marketing practice about 200 years old, and marketing discipline about 100 years old. Marketing discipline got organized around three things. One is around institutions or channels of distribution, and this is directly consequence of marketing as a spin-off from economics. Economics only talked about value creation or production side, not value distribution. In fact, it was never at one time not even recognized as a part of the GDP of a nation. So marketing was a value add X factory. And that was all about channels of distribution, wholesalers, retailers, distributors, dealers, whatever the words we used between consumer markets and industrial markets. and marketing became to specialized discipline to focus on that and divorced itself from economics. That is called the institutional school of marketing. The second one was focusing on products, including brands, and that became the commodity school of marketing. And finally, marketing as a value add activities, the functions of marketing like advertising, logistics, warehousing, financing, whatever they were, pricing, and that became the functional school of thought. It got unified further by the 4 P's of marketing, which came only in the 50s, which is product, price, place, and promotion, and with a focus on, as I mentioned, FMCG, fast moving consumer goods, or what we call in the US CPG, consumer products industry or goods primarily. American Marketing Association was established in 1936. It provided the definition of marketing and further unified the discipline. You don't have a discipline unless there is a definition of the domain that you are interested in, unless there is a description, and most importantly, there is an explanation, theory. Why is the question, not what or how. Marketing science, another major institution, was established in 1967. It provided seed money to conduct research on what is referred to as MSI research priorities, which means both the industry and the academic collaboration looking into the future where neither has any answer. In some ways, again, it was anchored to the CPG industry, first set of investors into MSI from the industry were all consumer products companies. My professor, John Howard, actually was the advisor in creating MSI, which was in Philadelphia for a while, but eventually it moved to Boston area in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because the alignment with Harvard University at one time. Both AMA as well as MSI represented what is known today as the managerial perspective. Economics also had managerial economics. John Howard, my professor, was trained as an economist, and he was very fond of managerial economics, and he wanted to do the same thing in his textbook, Managerial Marketing. So the focus was managerial perspective. All of this was great till the 60s. In the 60s, marketing began to diverge into 3 distinct subdisciplines. Marketing management, which is now called marketing strategy. A brand new discipline was created called consumer behavior, CB, and market research became marketing science, eventually marketing analytics. Each one has separate courses and textbooks. Each one has its own membership associations. AMA primarily for managerial, ACR for consumer behavior, which is Association for Consumer Research, and Informs, which is really all about quantitative methods, but ISMS, which is the marketing aspect, information sciences, marketing sciences, is a very key area, and that begins to become eventually marketing analytics. From market research, it begins to go to quantitative marketing, marketing analytics, or marketing science. So let's look at the evolution of each one of the subdisciplines in terms of concepts and practices. As I mentioned earlier, marketing management evolved through 4 P's of marketing, 3 schools of thought: institutional, commodity, and functional. Then we came out with concepts of segmentation, positioning, and targeting. Every textbook today still has that series of chapters on segmentation, positioning, and targeting. It began to shift in the 80s. Rather than focusing on customers and markets, it began to think about competition. And this is because after the first major energy crisis in 72-74, competition became hyper competition. And we also had people like Michael Porter in economics or in industrial organization, industrial economics, talking about Five Forces of Competition, Competitive Strategy, and his book in 1984 on competitive strategy became the Bible in marketing, not just in management. From competitive strategy, marketing begins to shift more away from product as a focal of interest to more and more services as America was becoming more a services driven economy. So we began to have a standalone thinking in the services industry and how services are different than products. Services are intangible, they are perishable, all that stuff. And it led to a huge series of research on services marketing that we know today. Still popular. In fact, with the technology, services marketing may be coming back now. Services marketing really talked about relationship over time, whether it's your barber, hairstylist, whether it's your doctor or dentist, or your wealth manager, or your teacher. Doesn't make any difference. All of the services industries were not transactional, but they were relational, which led to the whole startup in the early 90s on relationship marketing. It also coincided very well because in the traditional product categories, we had saturated. 95% of the customers would have a television set, washing machines, automobiles, everything that we sold. So the marketing was no longer acquisition of customers as a retention of customers. The incremental growth from new customers was so small, retaining existing customers was more powerful. Again, during that energy crisis, we began to understand what matters is post-sales activities, loyalty programs, and customer loyalty is more important to invest than customer acquisition, which led to the whole school of relationship marketing. At Emory University, we had a center for relationship marketing led by myself and my colleague Atul Parvatyar. Many conferences we organized, books came out, and became almost a standalone discipline. We still see the remnants of relationship marketing, especially from loyalty programs viewpoint, quite thriving and surviving. Marketing began to find new domains for managerial perspectives. Emerging markets became the immediate offshoot. Growth was only in emerging markets like China and India, eventually Africa, and therefore the multinationals in packaged goods industries began to shift their interest toward emerging markets. Emerging markets became more attractive because of the United Nations and IMF policies of converting the buying power from per capita income to purchasing power parity. Because of the currency fluctuations or denominations were not fixed exchange, it was very possible that many of the emerging countries had better buying power than what their per capita income will suggest. So you take the same market basket of goods and compare how much buying power they have. In the process, emerging markets began to look very attractive. And of course, China has clearly shown from low income, feudal system almost pretty much has become very contemporary, modern, middle income to almost high income nation. India is following the same thing, and in about 20, 30 years, many parts of Africa will follow the same thing. So emerging markets has continued as a journey. Second area has been social media. All of a sudden, we have this internet explosion, internet universality, but more importantly, the social media like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, WeChat, just goes on and on all over the world. And these are very large databases. For example, I've always said that there are nations bigger than China and India, and that's called Facebook nation or WhatsApp nation. 2 billion subscribers each. Lots of data are out there. And so managerial interest has gone on what is called online word of mouth communication. How do we advertise into the social media? Is there an influential marketing? Is it different than advertising on television? Can we do more and more nano segmentation, segment of one? All that stuff is coming along. And the next area that is starting to emerge as a focal area is societal marketing. marketing for a better world. It was always there in the sort of a macroeconomic or macro marketing area, but it has now come to the forefront with sustainability. There's a strong belief system that there's a fundamental climate change which is going to impact the world economy and will impact definitely coastal cities. The seasons will change, and what can industry do to prevent catastrophe or a tsunami down the road? This is the background. So, what are the new frontiers of research in managerial marketing? The first and the still very important one, it was advocated in the 80s, never took off very well, but it's becoming the core, is customer centricity, or how do you create value for customers? And of course, from a customer viewpoint, you have three customers. A customer is a buyer, which is what we are focused in buying behavior, buying, selling, which is the trading aspect. But a customer is a user also and a payer. So user is looking for performance value, and how do you deliver that? Payer is looking for a price value, how do you deliver that? And buyer is looking for convenience, easy to do business with, and how do you do research in that area? Which is why if you look at the online procurement or online ordering, you find that it seems to have all the advantages in its favor as compared to brick and mortar retailers. So if I go to online, for example, Amazon or its counterparts, Flipkart in India or Alibaba in China, they're very easy to do business with. I don't have to repeat the same thing again and again as I do at a supermarket, for example, or a department store. Information is stored. I can easily click a button and I can buy a new product. The product is delivered at home. Don't have the transaction cost of going to the store. Prices are relatively same or cheaper, so I get a price value. Performance, they certify the products just like a retailer like a Walmart will do, so that is equalized, which is why everything is in favor of online as compared to the brick and mortar retailing. So creating value customers, and it's very simple formula in marketing. It's not a rocket science. If you deliver a superior product at competitive or below competition price in a customer friendly manner, you will always win the market share. It's that simple. Executing that in a corporation is not that easy. But the first major area would be how do we create value for customers? Second area is brand value. Brand as intangible assets have become very important in the balance sheet, especially in merger acquisitions. So when Time Warner buys AOL and pays this ungodly price for revenues that were so little, it made no sense except the brand value was strong. Today you have the brand finance, you have the brand interface. Those are the companies that measure value of the brand independent of the product or manufacturing what they do or our services they offer. And the brand valuation is becoming a key asset building for the company. In marketing, I don't think we have done as much on brand value from a finance viewpoint. In other words, can we put an accounting lens or a finance lens? We have done significant research in having a brand as an asset and its correlation with financial performance, as we have done with customer satisfaction and its correlation with financial performance. But I'm talking about looking at a brand altogether differently. What are the licensing opportunities for the brand? What is the customer lifetime value, or what is the customer or brand lifetime value in this case? That may be ungodly, far more than customer lifetime value. So the brand value, brand creation is becoming another major discipline. How do you create new brands constantly, change the brand, rather than create an innovation, brand it and keep it forever? All this research is very new and quite interesting. Third one is discipline of selling. As I mentioned, selling is as old as the civilization. And selling practice has been always there. We have books after books on what makes a great salesman. the death of a salesman kinds of theater plays out there. We have always talked about how do you organize an efficient sales organization? What branch systems do you have? Should you have what routes in which people do selling? All the stuff we have done. But we still don't have the discipline of selling. It doesn't have a theory underlying of its own. I think it's going to happen in the decade of the 20s. Selling is a very major expenditure for corporations, major influencing mechanism. My view is that it may come more from other disciplines in terms of concepts of persuasion, for example, in terms of concepts of precipitation. It comes from sociology, social psychology, communication field, and we may be able to create a theory in that area. But right now, many universities are creating centers of excellence on selling. So selling is going to become more and more dominant in the decade of the 20s. Similarly, pricing. I call it science of pricing. While we know behavioral economics, which is the old thing we did in marketing 50 years ago, experiments with, hiding the label, raising the price, using laboratory approach, sometimes field studies. But what we need is theory of pricing. Economic theories of pricing anchor to ability to pay and willingness to pay, or elasticity of price, primarily, marginal utility concept. All of that may be fine, but I think pricing needs another lens, another perspective from other disciplines. We give the behavioral perspective, just noticeable difference by Weber, which Ken Monroe popularized and used heavily in the marketing discipline as a pricing. But today pricing is a lot more capable. On dynamic pricing, online pricing, we have the data even. So I think pricing will deserve a lot more scientific approach in marketing. And I therefore call it the science of pricing. Can we come out with another major research theory in that area? Just theory of pricing, not theory of marketing or a general theory of marketing. That's the second key area in terms of selling and then pricing. Third one is, or number 5 in my chart, is reverse marketing. Two Canadian professors actually wrote a book called Reverse Marketing in a B2B context. They were ahead of the game, but they were right. Today, reverse marketing is the new reality. In a B2B market, all procurement is online. The buyer actually starts initiating ordering. Most of that is order replacement cycle and can be done by automation and artificial intelligence. Inventory replacement. New orders, I think the buyer usually gets the specs from the engineering department and negotiate the price and the delivery all online. So B2B, it's almost universal. B2C, in the consumer markets, we are buying more and more through market exchanges, e-commerce platforms, especially given the major problems of time and convenience today with working women households. People have no time to go to the neighborhood shopping centers even. And of course, when you have coronavirus, you basically stay at home and therefore you have merchandise come to the house rather than you go to the market. Market comes to the home, home does not go to the market. That's a key change. And in the process, marketing becomes more supply chain management. As we have experienced with tariffs on China, as we have experienced again with the coronavirus, for example, all of that says that we need to have marketing completely flipping around. At one time, you produce the products, you had raw materials, you did the value add, stored it in the warehouse, displayed in the retail stores, and they're waiting for the customers. Today is everything reverse. So we need to have a new knowledge in that area, very fascinating area. I'm personally more involved in that area myself about what new theories we have to create when it is reverse marketing. Point number 6, there is a typo there. It should be theory of online sales promotions. Sales promotion has exceeded advertising. in the 90s, the dollar amount we spend. Sales promotions have become very big expenditure. We really again have no theory. We have good practices, whether email marketing works better, point of sale promotions, for example, 2 for 1, all the deal proneness and all that stuff is there. But again, it looks like we have anecdotal story, maybe some scientific numbers, etc., but there is no theory. Why people fall for sales promotions? Does sales promotion create preponement of the same brand? Does it work better if there's a sales promotion on your existing loyal customers, or is it really designed to acquire new customers? Just goes on and on. So I do believe that we need a theory, especially in the online e-commerce world, about the use of sales promotions and how they complement advertising or how they complement other marketing mix. The last and the most important area for new research opportunities is marketing for a better world. Today, most corporations have lost trust with the people. There's a huge skepticism that corporations and capitalism in the process is beneficial to the society. So the institution of capitalism, as represented by private sector or profit-seeking entities, is under siege. Lots and lots of negative opinions are now coming out. People slam immediately any misbehavior by a corporation. So corporate reputation is at stake, which is a foundation. Without that trust, people may not do business. So there's a strong worry that one needs to suggest how marketing can be more a positive societal force. Any problem a corporation faces today is blamed on marketing. Marketing is what I call the Rodney Dangerfield, a comedian who always started by saying, I get no respect. Marketing is a value add function, but it is not recognized as so within the company, surprisingly, and definitely by the society. So how do we create that positive image about marketing becomes a very important area for the survival of the discipline itself. And I would suggest that we need to really go back to probably one of the best management thinkers of the 20th century, Peter Drucker. While his focus was on management principles, he probably suggested things about marketing more insightful than any marketing professor. Two of the things are very relevant. The first he mentioned was that the purpose of business is to create and retain customers, not profit. Profit is the outcome, totally different perspective. And the second one was very, very key. He said there are only really two real functions of value add, innovation and marketing. We are always admiring innovation. Nations, leaders always say we should be innovative. They invest millions of dollars on the R&D side, but they neglect marketing. Peter Drucker was so right that a great innovation without proper marketing is useless. And of course, great marketing without proper product is also useless. So I think this symbiotic relationship between innovation and marketing, we need to figure out how to create more research and suggest in the process that marketing inherently has the potential to create value for the not only customers but for the society at large. There's a whole non-profit sector, and surprisingly, non-profit sectors are using marketing principles better than marketing people in the for-profit sector. So there are 7 new research initiatives or new frontiers of research in what I would call managerial marketing. If you analyze all this, marketing is really going back to from strategy, which began with competition focus, back to managerial. Most of them are related back to our simple framework of 4 P's in marketing, but more scientific research on each one of the P's. We have done quite a lot with brand management, product management, but not enough with selling, pricing, for example, or marketing for the society, goodness of the society. My own view is that marketing right now is going through a midlife crisis. I know it will come out of the midlife crisis, but there will be times when, as a subdiscipline, it is likely to plateau before it comes back again, before it is revived by somebody. And in the meanwhile, the other two subdisciplines will grow in this decade, the decade of the 20s. So let me stop here and now get into the next area, which is the evolution of consumer behavior. Consumer behavior as a discipline really is spin-off from market research. So it begins primarily as a market research tool for marketers to get the opinion of the consumers, sentiments of the consumers before they offer the product or even design the product. Test marketing was done, for example. Concepts were tested in advertising. But the discipline of consumer behavior really begins with what is known as motivation research and public opinion research. That is where the market really begins. Most of that was anchored to clinical psychology or to social psychology. Clinical psychology was primarily very interesting in terms of getting back to Freud. In fact, there was a belief that in economics, you have the rational consumer who knows what to do right, what is good for himself or herself. Then you have the irrational or a behavioral consumer. The focus on irrational or irrational would be the word I would use, as it was used in the literature, became the mainstream. All the aberrant behavior that consumers could not be explained by economics became part of the market research. Ernest Dichter was a giant in his field. He was a practitioner consultant, but invented techniques or used techniques like focus groups, in-depth interviews, and projective techniques. Became very, very popular at one time. It began to become even more and more physiologically instrument-based understanding of people, not what people say, but what people do. And therefore it began to look at things like tachistoscope, galvanic skin pressure, and of course pupil dilation. None of them survived in the long run because discipline began to shift from motivation research to more and more what I call multi-attribute attitude models. That was becoming popular in social psychology, that there is predisposition not out of sheer habit or unconsciousness, but there is a cognitive structure underlying, and that cognitive structure would be very important to understand, and how that creates a predisposition, foundation underlying it, and of course behavioral intention, and ultimately actual buying behavior. And there are all kinds of models. You had the models of conjunctive model where all the attributes have to be satisfied at a minimum level, or a disjunctive model where one attribute will dominate. That is the one on which you decide which choice to make. Or lexicographic where attributes are sequential, gating mechanism in some way, or just linear additive. And you multiply by the importance of the attribute times its evaluation of a given product, and you come out with a typical linear model of some sort. That area grew enormously. I had several doctoral dissertations. I published quite a lot in this area, and it began to then go into more information processing. The two overlap quite a lot in many ways, but I like to separate the two. Because focus in information processing was not how attitudes are created, but how the stimuli influence the attitudes. How does the information get processed? The whole research approach changed from survey research to more and more laboratory research. Experimental approach came in more and more. So you have a stimulus and you see how it is processed by the brain in terms of all kinds of memory aspects, filtering aspects, Do you have a selective attention, selective retention? All of that literature came in. Ultimately, short-term memory, long-term memory became the key elements to study information processing. You had the concepts of information overload by academics like Jack Jacoby or Jack Jacoby. Of course, the well-known person has been here, Jim Bettman, who has spent all his life of 4 or 5 decades just doing research on information processing. So this became a dominant field in marketing for a while. And it began to morph into more and more physiological measure, just like motivation research, into brain research. Today, brain research is there, very expensive. fMRI, as it is called, imaging and looking at the imaging, is very much similar to any kind of a Rorschach test, where you see a pattern and you begin to have a good expert interpret that pattern. We do the same thing in brain research, maybe a little more scientific, where inter-subject, inter-expert validity is much stronger. Now, this begins to become too narrow for the field. And there was a revolt against this one, that we are becoming too narrow toward one framework. Consumer behavior is as complex as an elephant, and there is only one blind man touching the elephant, coming out with partial theory. We need a lot more different people. One blind who touches the tail thinks it's a rope. One who touches the legs, it's a trunk of a tree. Just goes on, the typical fable of 6 blind men or 5 blind men and the elephant. Consumer behavior is more holistic, more complex. You cannot understand that unless you live and breathe with it. Therefore, the influence of sociology and anthropology now comes in the literature, and people like Russell Belk organize what is called Odyssey research. You as a researcher immerse into the field, no prior theories, no prior stereotypes about how consumers behave or how they should behave, as in economics, a prescriptive side, but you begin to observe without judgment. If anything else, you have a biased judgment that they know what they are doing better than we as scholars know what they are doing. And immerse yourself in the whole holistic reality of consumption, which includes information, includes influence, includes search, includes consumption, and of course disposal. End to end, the holistic approach. Odyssey research had a great potential. It lasted for about a decade, but ultimately Odyssey research it fizzled out because early pioneers began to do some of the research rather than have a continuity of research by the same scholars as was the case for information processing. Now we are again back from more macro approach, more holistic approach, back to micro again, and the behavioral economics comes in. Economics began to shift as a discipline from strictly the rational economics to classic paper by George Katona in 1954. What's the difference between a rational consumer and a psychological consumer? Consumers behave logically, they behave psychologically. They don't behave logically, psychologically. And that literature comes into economics. Nobel Prizes were given to Herbert Simon, who was not an economist. Kahneman also got the Nobel Prize, not an economist again. And of course, Richard Taylor got the Nobel Prize for pioneering research in behavioral economics. If you look at behavioral economics, it resembles the old consumer behavior we did, both in laboratory and in the field, where you hide the brand name and see what people give as a preference, where you hide the price, for example, where you manipulate the price, a lot of behavioral economics. I think behavioral economics itself will now plateau in economics because the next area of Nobel Prize winners are all about field experiments. Let's say poverty reduction. The last Nobel Prize winners, the pair, husband-wife, who got the Nobel Prize, Nobel Committee is deciding to shift the discipline of economics from behavioral economics to something that is societally relevant, And as that happens, we will also begin to shift in marketing the same way. So behavioral economics now begins to transition in marketing, or in CB in this case, toward what is known as transformative consumer research. Neglected areas of consumption that we need to understand. Consumption and consumers. Huge interest in poverty, low-income consumers, unorganized sectors, societal problems, interest in fine arts, music, paintings, movies, etc. begins to become very eclectic, but it is something where the interest is toward areas where we did not do the traditional focal point, which was consumer packaged goods industries. There are several new frontiers of research in consumer behavior. I think this is a very powerful future area. This is my area of discipline when I began way back when in the, well, 55, 60 years ago now. And here are the 7 new frontiers of research. First one is focusing on user experience, customer engagement, whatever you call them. For the first time, CB begins to differentiate or separate from buying. A customer is a buyer, but a customer is user also. With the social media and all of the text messages, post-purchase experiences, with influencer coming in word of mouth online, with the data coming in a significant way, I think we will shift the CB research interest not from a buying behavior toward a user behavior. The theory of buyer behavior that John Howard and I created, published in 1969, which we reprinted in 50th anniversary this year or early late last year, is now we need a theory of user behavior, not just buying behavior. Big area of research, which leads to the second area, which is social media engagement. Why people engage in social media? What are underlying motivations? How do you remain loyal in social media? It's the same kind of a thing, but focuses on social media as a major new area of relationship among consumers or among people. That's, I think, a major area. Third one is what I've been advocating, mindful consumption. If you add the modernization and the creation of middle class, which are all brand conscious, China, India, and Africa, you are adding 3 billion people additionally as modern consumers. There is no planet that can replace itself or renew itself to support this huge pressure. Sustainability will become a very key issue both in consumer behavior and in policy as well as in marketing. So the idea around here is that how can we motivate consumers to consume more consciously? Mindfulness is a construct, very prevalent in all disciplines. So mindful consumption is very key. We overconsume. Obesity is a problem. We waste quite a lot till we are made conscious. I don't think it requires even economic penalties or economic incentives. They are nice, but underlying consciousness becomes very key. And I was surprised in my research on sustainability. I found that largest footprint of carbon is not at the factory or in the transport, interstate transport, let's say from California, agricultural products coming all the way to the East Coast in Atlanta, 2,500-mile journey, but actually it is at the point of consumption. Each home spews out enormous carbon footprint. Refrigeration at home is another area. Personal automobile, which is a part of home consumption, is another big area for pollution, air pollution, and CO2. Next area, of course, are the supermarkets in the neighborhood. In other words, factory is the last place, except in thermal energy, factory may not be the largest polluter, surprisingly, but the home is the largest polluter. So we have to focus at the point of consumption, not at the point of production. And mindful consumption goes beyond just the 3 R's of conservation, recycling, reducing, and reusing, but I think one can go a lot more. And mindful consumption means consciously understanding how your consumption impacts not just you caring for yourself, but also caring for the community and caring for the planet. How does it impact the environment? Next area is what is I call group consumption. Basically, it says that in the social media world, consumption is no longer as individual, it's a collective consumption in some fashion. And consumption, collective consumption, we have not understood beyond household buying decisions. In other words, in a joint family between husband, wife, and the children, how do you decide when you buy autonomously, when you buy jointly or consume jointly? We are talking about here at a more macro level, at a nation level, for example. What is the consumption lifestyle from one country to the other country? Can we have an index? Just as we have an income disparity index like the Gini score, wealth disparity index, can we have a consumption disparity index, for example? That's where I'm thinking. Next area, number 5, is cross-cultural consumption. This is becoming more and more important because once we had trade, liberalization of trade in the 80s after the energy crisis, economies were not growing, therefore trade was used as a growth engine. More, let's say, free trade agreements were signed. Products began to cross national boundaries. We abolished the GATT regulation, GCATT. We created the World Trade Organization, WTO, and trade gave a huge ride toward economic growth for about a quarter of a century. But it also led to not only moving of products cross border, but people. And therefore we have within a country today more cultural heterogeneity than maybe between countries. Each country is like a melting pot. US probably leads the way. It is a large nation, large economy, where surprisingly the white majority is becoming minority in large states like California, Texas, and Florida. In fact, many market research companies now are calling the white population as one more segment Anglo. So the heterogeneity of consumption within the country is very important to understand from a cross-cultural viewpoint. It was done at one time in international marketing, but I think it will become a heart of CB research agenda. Next area is low-income consumers. I think this interest below the poverty level, which is defined by United Nations and other agencies as $2 per day income, $700 or $750 annual income per person in this case. That market I analyzed and I found it is equal to $5 trillion economy, except most products are unbranded and it is organized in an unorganized manner. In other words, it's an unorganized retail sector, has no efficiency, more local as opposed to internet global in its perspective. I think it's an area that can be modernized. Low-income consumers can have access to world-class products and brands cheaper than before. And many countries today, by leapfrogging into cellular technology, smartphones which are very affordable, I can have the low-income consumers use technology to modernize themselves. Last area is consumption of what I call free goods. All social media are free. But we have no theory of free goods. We always have in market exchange something of value I get, but I have to pay for it. While we do have the parks and recreation, the public library, many of the government benefits are free to the users, although they are paid through taxes. I think there's a whole need to understand more technology products and services, that what are the economics of free goods? How do you make money? Who supports you? Where do you get your cash flow? There's a whole area. To me, consumption of free goods will be another major research opportunity. Reflecting back, I was a young scholar today. The opportunities I had in CB 55, 60 years ago are nothing compared to the future opportunities young scholars will have. So I'm very much convinced that CB will continue as a discipline more and more and more. In fact, as it begins to focus more neglected areas of consumption, like what economists are doing in many ways, or psychologists are doing in many ways, they may divorce further from marketing. I do believe, however, that as we do more research in these areas, the traditional three experimental studies, case one, case two, study one, study two, study three, is very narrow approach to doing research in the field. We need to open up, more inclusive, a Big Ten theory. If it is a clinical study, that's okay. If it is a field study, that's okay. If it is a survey research, that's okay. If it's large scale analytics, which is consumer data analytics, it's okay, as opposed to the three experimental approach that we have taken so far. And as I mentioned, consumer behavior will further break away from marketing. I think it's more likely in the decade of the 20s than ever before. The third subdiscipline of marketing is marketing analytics. Evolution of marketing as a science really is the phenomenon of the 50s. There was a very strong criticism that marketing is a fairly touchy science, especially with focus on motivation research, opinion research, that there is no real actual behavior. You had economists like Paul Samuelson talking about revealed preference. Opinions don't matter. What matters is actual behavior in the marketplace. So there was a whole move towards starting to measure actual purchase behavior through what are known as panel data. These are longitudinal panels where you recruit 10,000, 14,000, 100,000 households to record in their diary everything they buy from the supermarkets and drugstores. MRCA was a major company, Market Research Corporation of America, based in Chicago, I think. And you had Chicago Tribune, which was a newspaper. They did a lot of research for showing why the newspaper is important for advertisers. And of course, eventually we had the scanner data. Scanner data even today are available. So marketing science, which means analyzing hard, real purchase data over time, is becoming now more scientific. Need for computers becomes very important, large-scale data crunching, software that can analyze statistical packages, that can analyze the data becomes important. At the same time, the whole discipline of business was being criticized as being not scientific enough, and therefore more like a trade as a discipline. Now how can we create a scientific discipline more like a social science? So operations research, which came from the military, began to invade all disciplines of business. In marketing, linear programming was used to look at advertising dollar allocation. You had the queuing theory used about how to create routes for the salespeople. You had, of course, stochastic models, Bernoulli model, or Markov chains, which began to analyze over time what are the, let's say, time-oriented, time series data. You had the econometric models. All of that tried to understand consumer much more in an objective way so that the researchers' biases are not as much inside. It really took off. We had giants names like Frank Bass, for example, William Massey, John D.C. Little, and they really exploded the discipline into what is known as mathematical models of marketing at that time. Several conferences were held, books were done, which are very interesting books when you go back to the history published in the 60s, essentially. From operations research, the discipline begins to shift in analytics to multivariate methods. I was a part of that movement. I did not believe that the traditional statistical inferential techniques are useful. as required in the econometric modeling, for example. We don't know how to properly specify all the equations because we don't know how to model itself from a quantitative viewpoint, a theory of something or a behavior of something. So I became more, even though I was trained in stochastic models, game theory, etc., I began to appreciate more because of my own interest in behavioral sciences to lean toward multivariate methods. This included techniques like discriminant analysis, factor analysis, and then eventually, of course, more newer techniques that were mostly invented by Bell Laboratories, such as cluster analysis, multidimensional scaling, and conjoint analysis. Paul Green at Wharton became one of the key leaders and advocates of the conjoint analysis and the multidimensional scaling techniques. His students, such as Vitala Rao, became the expert on conjoint analysis. So the discipline began to shift from econometric operations research techniques to more and more psychometrics or biometrics to some extent. Biometrics also came at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, in CB literature by looking at real measure of reaction, pupil dilation. In fact, CBS used pupil dilation to do the editing, post-production editing about where the interest of the person dies and how do I constantly keep up the interest by looking at the dilation in the eye. Brain research is continuing even today, as I mentioned, although it is so expensive that it is not as mainstream as it could be. This whole movement of multivariate methods ultimately culminates into Lizral as a technique. Richard Boghosi promoted that heavily, used heavily, and there was a time when there was not a single publication in Journal of Marketing Research without a Lizral model. You have to build a Lizral model, more comprehensive antecedents, mediators, moderators, and the outcome variables. And you have to show the path with which each one influenced the other, almost like simultaneous equations, but in a more elegant way and a little more theoretically anchored in the process. It forced you to theorize well as analyze well. Now we see the shift toward back to econometrics and also choice models. Choice models became very popular in the late 80s, well 90s essentially in my view, and marketing models came in, especially using econometric approach. How do you basically do the identification or isolation of heterogeneity issues, for example? It's much more craft, tactical, methods driving the theory rather than theory driving the methods essentially. And it is now morphing into what is known as marketing analytics. Marketing analytics primarily is because it is now using big data, messy data, scanner data, mostly text messages. And they're of course now getting emoji and video, but I'm going to talk about that a little later on. And they're analyzing this data which are not structured. They look like qualitative research at one time. They're all comments made by people. How do you analyze them in a more quantitative way with inferential statistics built into them is the more exciting area that we are going through in the first decade of the 21st century, and I think will continue in the second decade also. It's called marketing analytics. Mostly the big data and social media. So hundreds and hundreds of papers are published in social media data analytics because data are available both for feedback, post-purchase comments, as well as for actual behavior. So companies like Facebook data, Twitter data are all becoming relevant. What I find fascinating is that while this is continuing and it's exploding, surprisingly more waves of research opportunities will come in analytics than ever before. The first major one is text mining itself. We finally are finding a new technique, natural language processing, that is everybody's becoming comfortable It is getting standardized. There's an acceptance of one approach to that technique about analyzing verbiage, essentially, of people coming from cognitive psychology and also communication schools. It's a language that you begin to quantify. I find very fascinating that this text messaging clearly shows you that for the first time, data is in search of techniques, whereas in my generation, 55, 60 years ago, we had the techniques and we were looking for data. We were begging data from companies like MRCA, scanner people like IRI, Nielsen audit people, whatever they were, to say, please give us the data because we have this great technique that can analyze and give you insights into the markets or competition or consumers for that matter. So text mining will continue. But there will be another wave coming along, which will be what I call video analytics. The world is definitely going video. And YouTube is a symbol of that one. I'm told there are millions of YouTubes posted every day. It is user-generated content, but we don't have analysis of that content. We don't know how to analyze because we don't have a technique that can analyze video. Just like we invented techniques to analyze texts, we need to create techniques to analyze video. So to me, another major opportunity would be video analytics. Unfortunately, in marketing, we have never invented techniques that the world will use it. We have always borrowed techniques some other discipline created for us. To me, it doesn't matter how you get the techniques, how you create the techniques, its use will become more mainstream as the world shifts from voice in my days, telephone, to more and more messages or text, and now the video. In fact, most textbooks are now reverse. At one time you had the print copy with video supplement. Today there are video chapters with print as a supplement. Isn't that fascinating? So video is here in a big way. It's a big wave also. So video analytics is my second major area of research opportunity. Third one is emoji analysis. We are putting more emojis to sort of communicate sentiment or emotions. Fortunately, emoji has scientific base. The selection itself is based upon classification of emotions in a pictorial way or image. You do have the ideography coming from the Asian cultures, especially China, Japan, where they have understood ideography as a language. So my view is that emoji analytics, unlike video, will be less messy. It'll be done much faster, quicker, understanding or acceptance of the techniques, and the methodology will be there and might reveal information in a way that text does not reveal. Next area, one that I've been intrigued for almost 25 years now, is fuzzy logic. In mathematics, they created fuzzy logic in the Venn diagram theory, and the argument was that if you have only partial information, not full information, can you still create a pattern recognition? It's like something way out in the horizon. Can you detect it earlier before it comes, and can you recognize it? Very common in all manufacturing today. All cameras have fuzzy logic. Anything that has an instrumentation, there's a fuzzy logic. It calibrates more by automation, which humans cannot do it, or it takes a longer time. I think fuzzy logic will be very important when you have the messy data. You cannot see a pattern, and therefore you have some partial information, and how do you fill missing information, essentially, and still make something that is forecastable, predictable, and useful to marketers or useful to society. Next area is imaging research, not emoji research, but imaging research. Brain research is the only game in town right now, but there's a whole facial recognition coming in. It's becoming a mature technology. from a security viewpoint. Security agencies like TSA in America, as well as, in fact, all of the cameras that capture the crowds, while it is done usually in a criminal setting or a public safety viewpoint, I think it's going to become more and more commercially viable so that I can recognize image in a shopping center for any kind of a crowd behavior there. I can recognize at corporate security buildings, for example, just goes on and on. But imaging research will come in a little slower, but it's possible. It is usually post-event, but it can be used as a pre-event constant monitoring and can be very helpful in terms of data crunching, data analysis. But we are generating significant amount of video and images. The last area, and again my favorite, just like pattern recognition, is what I call forensic research. Who done it? It's very popular in criminal cases. You have programs like CSIS Miami, CSIS New York, CSIS Los Angeles. It's criminal investigation, sort of saying that if an event took place, a crime was committed, one can actually understand when it happened, how it happened, and who did it. All mystery stories are very fantastically written, whether it's Agatha Christie on the one hand or Earl Stanley Gardner, Perry Mason guy. They all were brilliant stories. I think forensic accounting is popular in accounting today. I think forensic marketing is necessary for one and one reason only. Surprisingly, even today, after doing market testing, pre-testing of the commercials, everything we do, test markets, unfortunately, record of new product introduction failure is very high. 70% of the new products fail. Whether those are minor changes in the products, like a packaging change, a flavor change, or whatever they are, or in fact, new variations of a product, or altogether new breakthrough products, whatever it is. Booz Allen Hamilton, or Booz as a new corporation, has collected this data over 50 years, and it shows you, despite all the research that we do pre-launch of a product, post-launch, 70% of the products fail. Only way out, therefore, is to do post-mortem. And post-mortem means forensic research. Very large opportunity of doing research as to why the product failed. It failed here and flourished there. Why? Especially products created in advanced countries, as they go into emerging markets, will they succeed or fail? And we have enough data to do forensic research. So let me summarize this. In the past, techniques were in search of the data, as I mentioned, in my generation. In the future, data will be in search of techniques. And now what we have is a huge tsunami of data, unlike 50 years ago. But it's a huge, powerful force. Will the disciplines of managerial marketing, marketing strategy, consumer behavior, and marketing analytics ever converge, or will they go farther apart? I'm very hopeful that they will converge because of four major forces which are driving everybody. It's a common sort of a context or texture behind the scene kind of a stuff. The first one is the rise of the emerging markets, clearly. And the new middle class, brand conscious. All three disciplines are doing research in that area from their perspective. Second one is social media. I've talked about it quite a lot, but the user-generated content is more insightful for understanding marketing or consumer insights than anything else in my view. In fact, it provides more insight for politicians, for societal issues. I think social media will become much more critical, much more strategic, and one can use that in marketing. We talked about marketing for a better world. Social media may be the data and the context which may provide us how to make a better world through marketing tactics. Third one is the rise of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Corporations are under a lot of pressure, not only to serve the shareholders or the investors, but all stakeholders. How are you good to your employees, your community, your suppliers, who are all becoming equally important. And the new Business Council resolution that they'll be serving all stakeholders as the new purpose of corporations, purpose-driven corporations, all these things are written up. My own book, along with Rasi Sodia and David, basically talked about what we call forms of endearment, which eventually led to conscious capitalism as a movement. There are 30, 40 chapters worldwide. So this is something that was almost like a lip service. A lot of skepticism, payoff for bad behavior. I'm a cigarette company, but I serve some communities, so people will tolerate my cigarette marketing, for example. I think this is much more in the DNA of the corporation, as we have advocated. And I'm very pleased that there is now companies are looking at it seriously. I also find that ESG funds, environmental, social, governance, are actually outperforming the regular S&P 500 indices. And large investors like private equity people, BlackRock or Blackstone are now saying we will invest only in companies that follow ESG. All of this stuff says that what was now lip service has become more mainstream in many ways. A lot of it is research opportunities. And the last one is sustainability. Neither technology nor capital will slow down the rise of countries like China, India, Africa. Africa as a continent. It is only the environment. I have several books written in this area, and my own view is that nature will be passively resisting. Unless you nurture nature, allow it to renew at its own pace, and make sure we have a mindful consumption, sustainability will become the key issue for both the governments as well as society in general and for the marketer. We have seen the rise of a teenager out of Sweden getting national visibility and openly, in fact, making comments and pleading with the current generation to say, do something now for her generation. Greta Thunberg is very articulate, very passionate. Think about younger generation telling the older generation what to do right. It's absolutely mind-boggling change in the society. So sustainability is the next platform which will come together. All top journals, Journal of Marketing, Journal of Marketing Research, JCR, Journal of Consumer Research, JAMS, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, and Marketing Science are all converging their publications around these 4 external drivers of future consumption. What we need, therefore, is an inter-association or interdisciplinary specialized conferences between ACR, AMA, Marketing Science or ISIMS, on emerging markets, CSR, social media, and sustainability. I think the more we have a joint conferences across these subdisciplines, the better we are. We can actually be a catalyst for convergence given the opportunity that is given by the external environment. The only place where I've seen that all 3 subdisciplines come together is the AMA Sheth Foundation Doctoral Consortium, where about 100 top students from 100 universities who are the next generation of scholars are invited, and they're mentored for 3 days, 4 days by 150 scholars, hosted by each university. In 2020 will be at Indiana University. It was at Leeds University, New York University in 2019, 2018 was Leeds. I think that is where I see more commonality coming together, and I hope it happens. I've enjoyed this presentation. I know it's quite long. It has 3 parts, and you can basically watch each part, or you can break it up any way you want. But I hope this is something of interest to you. Thank you.